As we look at Psalm 54, we have entitled Psalm 54, The Bulwarks of David's Soul. The Bulwarks of David's Soul. Very quickly, let's notice an outline of Psalm 54. We're not going to spend a great deal of time in this location tonight, but we want to get a general layout of this psalm so that as we go back and notice the background, that we can come back and forth and see exactly what David's talking about. The first 3 verses deal with David's supplication. We've seen this a number of times in the Psalms where David calls out for God's help. And that's what he's doing in these opening verses. He says, "Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God, give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them." And then there's a pause. The next part of the psalm deals with David's expectation in verses 4 and 5. And in these verses, David expresses his confidence that God is his helper, and that God will come to his aid, and that God will judge his enemies. And then in verses 6 and 7, as this psalm draws to a close, we see David's adoration. And the book of Psalms is a book of worship, where David praises God for who He is and for what He has done. And so he does that in talking about the sacrifice that he wants to offer and the praise that he wants to give to God for the salvation that God has brought to him. Now, we don't use the word bulwark every day, but it aptly describes this psalm and what is taking place in this psalm. A bulwark is a strong support or protection. Those of you who have lived on a river system or on some big lake probably are aware that many individuals will build a wall, a retaining wall, along the water's edge to keep the water from washing away their property. And that wall serves as a buffer against the waves that would beat against the shoreline. David is speaking of God in much that same way in this psalm, of how that God is a buffer for him. God is a protector for him. There are those who are coming up against David, and God is standing in their way of being able to do what they want to do to him. In verse 3, David speaks of strangers that were risen up against him. Here were individuals that, as we will learn later in our lesson, were Israelites. They were from Judah. And so they were not strangers in the sense that they were foreigners. They were not strangers in the sense that they were people who did not know God. But they were strangers in the sense that they did not know David, did not care about him, were not concerned about what happened to him. They were strangers to David. They were not friends to him. They were individuals that turned their backs on him. They were individuals who turned their backs on God. But he also speaks of oppressors who were seeking after his soul. These oppressors, among them would have been Saul, who was pursuing David and persecuting David, and we'll see that as we move through the psalm tonight. Now, David was confident that the siege of his soul would not be successful, that God would help him, that God would deliver him, and that he would overcome his enemies. He says in verse 4, "Behold, God is mine helper. The Lord is with them that uphold me." And so David talks about 2 lines of defense. First and foremost, God is his helper, but then he talked about others who also would uphold him, others who also would help him. And David was thankful for those who upheld him. We as well ought to be thankful for those who uphold us, for those who pray for us, for those who encourage us, for those who defend us, for those who help us. We ought to be thankful for them. And God, of course, works and operates through them and through their efforts on our behalf. Now, in order to appreciate this psalm, we have to understand a little bit about the background of this psalm. And perhaps your Bible contains a heading to the psalm. And if so, it probably suggests that this psalm was written out of the background of the occasion where David was delivered from Saul. The Ziphites betrayed David. They told Saul where David was. And Saul came down to capture and to kill David. But God delivered David from the hand of Saul. And that's 1 Samuel 23 and 1 Samuel 24. Now there's another occasion when the Ziphites also betrayed David, and that's 1 Samuel chapter 26, But it seems like 1 Samuel 23 and 24 is the background of the events that take place right here. And so we want to consider those passages and what they have to say about this. Now notice in 1 Samuel chapter 23 in verses 7 and 8 that it was told Saul that David was come to Keilah. And Saul said, God hath delivered him into mine hand, for he is shut in by entering into a town that hath gates and bars. And Saul called all the people together to war, to go down to Keilah, to besiege David and his men. Now if you notice the context beginning in verse 1 of chapter 23, David has gone to Keilah and David has delivered that city from the Philistines. He has done them a great favor. And yet they are not going to repay that favor to David, but rather they're going to betray David into the hands of Saul. At least that's what they're going to attempt to do. If you look at this passage in verse 7, it says, it was told Saul. You're going to see that several times within this context. It was told Saul. Saul had spies throughout the land. He had individuals throughout the land that were watching for David, and if they saw David, then they would send word to Saul to let Saul know where David was. David was a wanted man. He was wanted dead or alive. And Saul probably preferred that he be dead. Saul wanted to remove David. He saw David as a rival to the throne. From the time that the women first sang that Saul had killed his thousands and David had killed his 10,000s, Saul set his heart against David and determined to kill him. Now God's anointed David. David's going to be the next king. And there's nothing that Saul can do to prevent that. God has rejected Saul because Saul rejected him and disobeyed his word. But Saul continues to pursue David in an attempt to overthrow him and to kill him. God delivered David time and time and time again. Notice in this context in verse 7, Saul says, God hath delivered him into mine hand. Isn't it amazing that Saul thinks that God is on his side? Now David has done nothing but good to Saul. He's been a loyal subject to Saul. He played his harp and comforted Saul. He went and killed the giant and delivered Saul and his army from the Philistines. David has done nothing but good for Saul. And Saul has done nothing but evil toward David. And yet Saul believes that God is on his side. And that God has somehow delivered David into his hands. That's amazing to me. It's amazing to me when we deal with people just generally in the world that they believe that God's on their side. And that God's working and operating on their behalf. Even though they're living lives in open rebellion to God and to His will. They believe and they would tell you that God is helping them. Well, Saul believed that here. And he believed that God had delivered David into his hands. You see, most of the time David didn't enter into cities. Because it was harder to get away from a city. And Saul knew that. Saul knew here's a city that has walls and gates, and David's inside that city, and so we will surround this city, and there's no way for David to get away. There was a problem with Saul's plan. And the problem with Saul's plan is, yes, David was walled in, but he wasn't walled in by the walls of Keilah, but rather he was walled in by the protective arms of God. And Saul was not going to be able to lay hands on him because God was going to be this bulwark of defense for David. And no matter how close Saul got to David, he never would be able to lay hands on David because of God's protection. You may remember that there were times when David and Saul were in the same cave together. You talk about walled in, that's walled in. David's in the cave, and while David and his men are in the cave, Saul comes in the cave. Well, imagine trying to get away from a situation like that. And yet David managed to get away, even on occasions like that, because God was with him and God was defending him. If you look at the context, you see one of the great betrayals in history. David has delivered this city from the Philistines. And David begins to inquire of God as to whether or not the men of this city will turn him over to Saul. And God tells David very plainly, yes, Saul will come down, verse 11. Yes, they will deliver thee up, verse 12. After all you've done for them, this is how they're going to repay you. David, just get used to it. This is the way it's going to be. Have you ever had that happen in your life? Have you ever helped somebody at a time when they really needed help? You did everything you could to relieve their burden, to relieve their suffering, and then later on, instead of repaying you in a positive and a kind way, they repaid you evil for good? Oh, how disappointing that is. How discouraging that is. That happened to David. But it didn't just happen to David here. It's going to happen to him again and again in this context. David continues to do good. He continues to do the right thing, even though those that he helps often do not repay him for what he's done. Notice in verse 13, we see David, and he's still on the run. It says, then David and his men, which were about 600, arose and departed out of Keilah, and went whithersoever they could go. And it was told Saul that David was escaped from Keilah, and he forbore to go forth. Verse 13 really captures how pressed the situation was, how dangerous the situation was for David and his men. You see that David is traveling with a rather small band, 600 men. And notice that when they get ready to go out of this city, they went whithersoever they could go. They got out of Dodge. They got out of this city. And you have men literally going in every direction trying to get out of the city. Saul is that close to them. Saul is just about to lay hands on them. And so they're going in every direction trying to get out of this city before Saul surrounds it and before they're captured. That's how bad it was. Notice again in verse 13 we have the same words. And it was told Saul. You see, Saul has his spies. David continually has those that are watching his every move and reporting those moves to Saul. David's faced with that. Notice verse 14. David abode in the wilderness in strongholds and remained in a mountain in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God delivered him not into his hand. Verse 14, David goes back to the wilderness. You can get walled in the wilderness too, but it's harder to wall somebody in the open field than it is in the city. And so David's not going to be in a city. He's going to be in the wilderness. And he's going to hide out in the woods. Easier to come and go. Easier to escape detection in a place like that. And notice David's going to be in a mountain in the wilderness of Ziph. Now, the reason why you'd be on a mountain is because you're in a better defensive position if you're on the mountaintop. If they're going to take you, then they're going to have to climb that mountain. And you're in a far better position than they are. But you also consider the fact that David, from the mountaintop, would be able to watch the advance of Saul. And if Saul was coming, he would be able to watch Saul's movements long before Saul ever knew exactly where he was. And David could move about and escape detection and escape capture in that way. And so there's a great deal of wisdom in this from a military standpoint. Now, notice as well in verse 14 that Saul sought him every day. There was not a day passed where David could relax. There was not a day that passed where David could let his guard down. There was not a day that passed where David didn't have to worry about Saul finding him and killing him. David lived under the constant pressure of a hunted animal, and Saul was hunting him. Saul had the resources as king. He had the men as king. He had the spies throughout the land. Every advantage was in Saul's favor, except for one, and that is that the Lord was with David. And notice in the last part of this verse, it says, but God delivered him not into his hand. That's the one advantage that David had, but it was a great advantage. And it was an advantage that Saul could not overcome, the fact that God was with him. Now, when you start reading these passages here and you see Saul hunting for David, you understand the connection, I think, to Psalm 54. And when David talks about those strangers that were after him. when he talks about those who were oppressing him and who were seeking his soul. You understand the background of that. You may want to notice 1 Samuel 24 and verse 11, and notice the language that David uses in talking to Saul. It's the same language as is used in Psalm 54. This is the occasion where Saul has been in the same cave with David. David has been encouraged by his men to kill Saul, saying that God had delivered Saul into his hands. And David went down and David cut off the skirt of Saul's garment, but he would not lay his hand on Saul because Saul was the Lord's anointed. And Saul gets up and Saul leaves the cave, and when he does, David comes out and shouts down to Saul and reveals to Saul, "You're counting me as your enemy. And you're telling everyone I'm out to get you." But David said, "If I was out to get you, you'd be dead right now. Because here's the skirt of your garment. I was close enough to cut that skirt off. How hard would it have been for me to take my sword and pierce you through? If I was your enemy, you'd be dead right now." But David said, "I'm not your enemy." And Saul has to acknowledge the fact on this occasion, "No, you're not my enemy. You've been more righteous than I have been." And Saul goes home, but he's not done. He's going to pursue David on another day. But on this day, he'll leave David alone. But notice in 1 Samuel 24 and verse 11, "Moreover, my father, see the skirt of thy robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the skirt of thy robe and killed thee not. Know thou and see that there is neither evil nor transgression in mine hand. And I have not sinned against thee. Yet thou huntest my soul to take it." You're hunting my soul. That's what he says in Psalm 54 and verse 3. Those that were seeking, hunting his soul. Saul was doing that. And David says to Saul, "I have not sinned against thee." And there is a great deal of implication in that statement. And the implication is, but you have sinned against me. What you're doing to me is wrong. But I've not returned that. I've not repaid evil with evil. But rather, I've repaid evil with good. I've not sinned against you. You've sinned against me. It would have been easy for David to have done to Saul what Saul was trying to do to him. David wouldn't do that. It's easy for us when somebody wrongs us to do to them what they're seeking to do to us. We need to take the high road and do as David did and to do good to them rather than evil. Seeking David's soul, a perfect parallel to the situation in Psalm 54. Now David's going to tell us, as he does in verse 13, that God helped David. He allowed David to escape from this city of Keilah. He allowed David to escape the next time as well from the wilderness when Saul has him hedged in. That's what Psalm 54 is about. Is behold, God is mine helper. God's going to help me. God's going to deliver me from those who are seeking to kill me. Now notice as well in 1 Samuel 23 and verses 16 and 17 that we have Jonathan. Jonathan is also talked about in Psalm 54. Beginning in verse 16, "Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David into the wood and strengthened his hand in God." Jonathan's David's friend, and Jonathan knows that his father is wrong. And Jonathan has been steadfast in his support of David, even though he knows that means he will not be king. Even though he knows that David will take his place. Jonathan continues to support David. And Jonathan goes and he strengthens David's hand. He encourages him. Do you remember in Psalm 54 and verse 4? David talked about, "Behold, God is mine helper," and that God would help those who uphold me. You know who one of those was that upheld David? It's Jonathan. Jonathan came out and upheld David. And God helped Jonathan because of what Jonathan did. We're going to find that the Ziphites are going to tell Saul where David is. But long before the Ziphites knew where David was, one in Saul's own family knew where David was. Jonathan knew where David was. Jonathan could have betrayed David at any time, but he did not do so. In fact, he was sworn to David. Notice in the context in verse 17, he said unto him, Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee. And thou shalt be king over Israel, and I shall be next unto thee. And that also Saul my father knoweth. Jonathan says to David, David, don't be scared. Don't be afraid. My father's hand's not going to be able to reach out and get you. God's anointed you to be king. And I'm going to be your supporter when you become king. I'm going to be next to you then as I am now. How encouraging it is to see one like Jonathan who would do the right thing even when he had to stand against his own father in order to do so. Even when he had to stand against and go against family to do right. You may have to do that at some point in your life. I've known of those who wanted to obey the gospel and their mother and father didn't want them to do that. And they had to make the decision to obey God rather than men. I've known others who had family members who became involved in sin and needed to be disciplined. They didn't stand in the way of that discipline, but they were the very ones urging the congregation to discipline them, urging the congregation to do the right thing because they loved them and they wanted them to come back and they wanted them to repent. They knew that was God's way and they encouraged it. Jonathan was that kind of a man. We need to be like that. And David talks about Jonathan in Psalm 54 when he talks about those that are upholding him and helping him. But notice also in verses 19 and 20, as we continue the discussion that leads to Psalm 54, it says in verse 19, Then came up the Ziphites to Saul, to Gibeah, saying, Doth not David hide himself with us in strongholds in the wood, in the hill of Hachilah, which is on the south of Jeshimon? Now here are the Ziphites, and they come up and they tell Saul where David is. They say, David's hiding among us. We know the very section of woods where he is. We know the hill where he's encamped. We know where David is. And then in the very next verse, they say this, Now therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of thy soul to come down. And our part shall be to deliver him into the king's hand. Saul, we know that you want David more than you want anything else. And you come down and we will give him to you. Now the Ziphites no doubt had an agenda, didn't they? Much like Joab had an agenda. Much as Ahithophel and Absalom had agendas. The Ziphites have an agenda. And the agenda is, Saul, we're going to help you because we know what you want more than you want anything else, and we're going to give it to you. Don't you imagine there were a few strings attached to that? Saul, here's what we've done for you. Now what are you going to do for us? How are you going to help us? Now in the psalm, the psalmist talks about the fact that they have not set their eyes on God. Notice in verse 3, For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them. Here were those who were not looking to God for what God wanted them to do. The Ziphites, they weren't looking to God to see what God wanted them to do. No, they were looking out for what was best for them, or what they thought was best for them, what they might get out of this situation. And they're willing to deliver over David to Saul. Now David's done nothing to them. David's not harmed them in any way. David's seeking refuge in the wilderness, in the woods. He's not bothering them in any way, and yet they're willing to betray him because they're confident that there will be something that will come to them as a result of their having done that. They're willing to sell David out in order to get something in return. Let's go on down in the context. And you see as we go down in the context that Saul is in fact going to come down. He wants to get David. See, verse 21, he thanks them. Saul said, "Blessed be ye of the Lord, for ye have compassion on me." Nobody has any compassion on me. Did David not have compassion on Saul? Sure, a number of times. If he had not had compassion on Saul, Saul would have been dead. David spared his life on a number of occasions.
What was the strength of Saul's army?
The strength of Saul's army, it was in the thousands compared to the 600 or so that were with David. Saul certainly could overwhelm David at any moment. Had he found David, he could have conquered David. That would not have been difficult. The problem was God was not allowing him to find David. David was always there, and yet Saul could never quite get him. Notice the context here, and you'll see that that's the case even this time. Saul says in verse 22, "Go, I pray you, prepare yet, and know and see his place where his haunt is. And who hath seen him there?" Think about that, where his haunt is. He's a ghost, Saul says. Every time I get close to him, he just disappears. He's like chasing a ghost. You can't lay hands on him. Now, Saul should have, somewhere along the line, realized there's a reason why I can't find him. There's a reason why I can't get him. God must be helping him. But Saul never realizes that. Again, he continues to think God is on my side. God's going to help me. He says, "Let me know where his haunt is, and who hath seen him there. For it is told me that he dealeth very subtly." Now, who was really dealing that way? It wasn't David that was dealing in an underhanded kind of way. It was Saul that was dealing that way. It was Saul that was involved in treachery and not David. People often accuse others of what they themselves are guilty of, and certainly that's the case here. It says in verse 23, "See therefore and take knowledge of all the lurking places where he hideth himself, and come ye again to me with the certainty, and I will go with you. And it shall come to pass, if he be in the land, that I will search him out throughout all the thousands of Judah." They arose and went to Ziph before Saul. But David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the plain of the south of Jeshimon. Now David's already moved. David was smart enough to know, and perhaps he was warned, either by Jonathan or by someone else. David could have had his spies as well. Saul had his. David could have had his spies. Jonathan was one who could tell him of Saul's movements, and so he's prepared. He may have watched the men of the city leave and going toward where Saul was, and he would have known what they were up to. Notice in verse 25, "Saul also and his men went to seek him, and they told David, wherefore he came down into a rock, and abode in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon." Here's the pursuit David's talking about in Psalm 54. Those that are seeking after his soul. Notice verse 26. This is beautiful. It's just beautiful to think about how close Saul got and never could get David. "And Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain." Here's Saul going down one side of the mountain. Here's David and his men going down the other side of the mountain. I'll give you an illustration of this. Some of you grew up hunting. Some of you grew up squirrel hunting. If you've ever done any squirrel hunting, this makes sense to you. You see a squirrel in the top of the tree, and you're trying to get to where you can get a shot at him. And so you start walking around the tree, and as you're walking around the tree, what's he doing? He's going to the other side of the tree. And every time you get in a position to where you think you can get a shot at him, he'll switch sides of the tree. And so you're down here where he's got you just walking around the tree, and you never can get a clear shot at him. Here's David. David's on one side of the mountain, Saul's on the other side of the mountain. If Saul crosses over, David crosses over. And so David's right there. But Saul can't find him. He can't lay hands on him. Notice he says, "And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul. For Saul and his men compassed David and his men round about to take them." Now eventually Saul, because he has more men, is going to surround David. And all he's got to do is tighten up the noose, and eventually David will be in his hands. But remember the psalm. Remember Psalm 54. David is thanking God for delivering him. So David's going to get away. Notice how this psalm ends. He's got him surrounded in verse 26, but in verse 27, but there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, Haste thee and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore they called that place, and I'll leave that word up to you. Verse 29, and David went up from thence and dwelt in the strongholds of En-gedi. I want you to think about this. Here's Saul, finally has found David. He finally has compassed David, surrounded David in some way. And about that time, a messenger runs up and says, Saul, you've got to come. The Philistines have come into the land, and you've got to go fight the Philistines. And so Saul withdraws, and David and his men get away again. What do you think David was thinking when David was on that mountaintop, and Saul and his men have him surrounded, and David sees the circle getting closer and closer and closer, and then all of a sudden he sees Saul and his men go away? I know what he was thinking, because I know what he does in Psalm 54. He says to God, God, I want to give you a sacrifice, and I want to offer it freely, and I want to praise you for your great name. David knew that God had just delivered him from Saul. Who caused the Philistines to come into the land so that Saul would have to leave pursuing David and go and defend the land? That's not hard. Not hard to understand. The same God that told David to go and fight the Philistines in Keilah and help David to gain a victory was the same God that later would use the Philistines to deliver David from the hand of Saul. That's how great our God is. And that's the kind of deliverance and help we can expect from our God. This is a great psalm because it shows us the loving care that God will give to us in the midst of our enemies. Psalm 23 talks about a table being prepared for us in the presence of our enemies. God will take care of us even if our enemies are all around us. And that was the case in Psalm 54. Thank you for your attention tonight.